Hey guys, tonight we walk into the oldest cities on Earth where mud brick walls glow faintly under a bronze dusk and tiny wedge marks pressed into clay still seem to hold the warmth of human fingers. You stand in the hush of ancient southern Mesopotamia where reeds whisper along black water temple towers rise above the flat land, and every basket of barley, every jar of oil, every nervous glance at the horizon feels like part of a larger pattern. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation and some parts are calm. What if imagination? We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Historians debate many of the stranger ideas tied to the Anunnaki, and the evidence, where it is thin, could suggest possibilities rather than certainties. You probably won't survive this place very well, by the way, mostly because the heat would bully you by breakfast and the mosquitoes would treat you like an all-you-can-eat festival buffet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time in the comments, because I always like seeing where in the world these sleepy little journeys are landing. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where so many good mysteries begin, not with a thunderclap, but with a room full of lists. Most historians agree that the first cities of Sumer were powered by accounting as much as by kings, before the famous legends. Before the giant personalities of myth stride onto the stage in their polished divine sandals, there are tablets, small square rounded chipped practical tablets, tablets that record barley deliveries, tablets that record sheep, tablets that note jars of beer, allocations of labour, temple rations, reeds, wool, copper, fish onions, dates. The earliest urban world does not introduce itself with a dramatic soundtrack. It introduces itself like a very old office. And honestly, that is part of its charm. The birthplace of civilization turns out to have been run at least partly by people whose daily lives involve checking whether the grain came in on time. Archaeology suggests that this habit of recording was not some side hobby for bored priests. It was the skeleton of the system. In the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates could nourish life and wreck it with equal enthusiasm, survival depended on coordination. Fields needed irrigation, canals needed maintenance, workers needed feeding, temples needed supplies, storehouses needed counting. If you wanted a city to exist for more than 5 minutes, someone had to know how much grain was in the bin and how many hands were available to dredge mud from the canal. That much is solid ground. But then the mood shifts gently, almost imperceptibly. You notice that the practical world of clay accounts and storehouse tallies lives side by side with another world, one full of omens, hymns, divine names, and anxious glances toward powers beyond human reach. The same civilization that counts fish with almost comic seriousness also tells stories of gods who shape destinies, send storms, and decide whether cities flourish or fail. One interpretation is that this pairing of paperwork and prayer reveals a culture trying to manage uncertainty from every possible angle. Count the grain, read the sky, patch the canal, offer the hymn, make the list, burn the incense, hope for the best. Because uncertainty is everywhere here. The evidence we do have points to a landscape that is both generous and unstable. Southern Mesopotamia is not Egypt, with a more predictable river rhythm, and a nice, reassuring corridor of green. This is a lower floodplain, where channels shift, salinity creeps into fields, embankments fail, and one bad season can turn confidence into worry with astonishing speed. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian life depends on delicately maintained systems. A city is not simply built and then left alone. It must be continuously negotiated with mud, water, labour, weather and time, which is where the mystery begins to feel less silly than it first sounds. Not because we suddenly leap into wild conclusions, and not because we are about to pretend a broken tablet is a secret memo from cosmic management. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is emotional rather than dramatic. When a civilization builds itself in a landscape, this fragile preparedness becomes a kind of religion even before religion enters the room. A careful reading might suggest that many of the habits preserved in the earliest records are habits of people who expect disruption. Store more, measure carefully, distribute rations, maintain channels, track obligations, watch for shortage, watch for overflow, watch for failure. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Plenty of societies manage resources without expecting apocalyptic doom. A more cautious explanation could be that Sumerians were simply competent administrators living in a difficult environment which, to be fair, already sounds exhausting enough. Still, it is hard not to feel the tension. You stand in imagination near one of those temple storehouses, the air warm and a little dusty, the smell of damp clay mixing with barley husks and lamp smoke. Somewhere nearby, a scribe presses a reed stylus into wet clay with little patient clicks. Tick, tick, tick. The sound is tiny, but it carries. You can almost hear the civilization teaching itself how to remember. Not memory in the poetic sense, though they had that too. Memory in the practical sense. How much came in? How much went out? Who owes what? Who gets fed? What must be ready when the season turns? And what if the story is pointing at something else? That question belongs to the mist, not the solid ground, but it is worth holding lightly in your hand. Later readers, especially modern ones with a taste for mystery, have looked at Mesopotamian myths and wondered whether the Anunnaki, those powerful divine figures in the tradition, were not merely acting within flood stories, but preparing for dangers even broader than flood itself. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has lingered because Mesopotamian literature often treats disaster as layered and recurring. Water is only one threat. Drought lurks too. Crop failure lurks. Political collapse lurks. Disease lurks. Invasion lurks. The flat horizon is calm until it absolutely is not. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki are part of the religious imagination of Mesopotamia, not straightforward historical beings walking around with clipboards and emergency plans. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, one interpretation is that divine stories preserve human fears in enlarged form. Gods prepare because people prepare. Gods measure because temples measure. Gods judge survival because survival is always being judged by the land itself. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian myths are best read primarily as theology, political symbolism, cultural memory, or some braided combination of all three. And there is the beautiful inconvenience of ancient evidence. It rarely behaves like a neat modern answer. The tablets do not sit up politely and announce, "Good evening, here is exactly what everyone believed and why." No, they arrive cracked, scattered and context-bound. Some are records, some are hymns, some are lexical lists, some are royal boasts which, like modern press releases, may benefit from being read with one eyebrow slightly raised. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you keep walking through the quiet archive of clay, through the temple courts, through the damp margins of canal water where reeds bend, and insects whine through a city that is inventing urban life, while also trying not to be swallowed by its own environment. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Tonight, that solid ground is already enough to unsettle you in the sleepiest possible way. Civilization begins here, not with confidence, but with maintenance. Not with certainty, but with management. Not with a grand speech, but with a checklist. And somewhere inside that old administrative heartbeat, A deeper rhythm may already be present, quiet as a stylus. Tapping clay, prepare, prepare, prepare. The flood will become the famous symbol later. But here at the beginning, before the big story swells into legend, you can already feel another possibility humming under the surface. Maybe the oldest fear was never just water. Maybe it was instability itself. Maybe people who lived between rivers learned very early that danger does not always arrive wearing a single face, and in the dim storehouse light with dust hanging in the air like fine brown gold, the lists go on. The lists stay with you as evening settles over the plain. Those little clicks of reed into clay, still sounding in your imagination like the oldest metronome in the world. Tick for barley, tick for oil, tick for sheep, tick for labourers, tick for offerings. The city is teaching itself to remember, and the memory it values most is practical. What's broadly accepted is that southern Mesopotamia demands this kind of attention. You do not get to live casually between powerful rivers and pretend the landscape will sort itself out. That is not how this place works. This place rewards vigilance and punishes optimism with the enthusiasm of a landlord who has found a new fee. Archaeology suggests that life in early Sumer unfolds under a constant negotiation with water, heat, mud, salt wind and time. The rivers are life-givers, yes, but they are not tidy life-givers. They split channels, shift courses, overrun banks, fail to rise where needed, and leave behind both fertility and ruin in the same muddy gesture. One season may bring abundance, another may bring cracked earth and anxiety, and a third may deliver the sort of flooding that makes your carefully stacked storage jars reconsider their whole career path. So before there is any grand flood legend, before later texts give catastrophe a memorable narrative arc, there is something simpler and more constant: watching. You can feel it everywhere. In the canal, edges repaired again and again. In the raised storage rooms. In the temple routines. In the way authority gathers around those who count, interpret, and anticipate. Most historians agree that irrigation management is central to Mesopotamian urban life. Cities do not merely sit beside rivers like tourists enjoying a scenic view. They engineer, maintain dredge, divert, and argue. Probably a lot of arguing honestly, because if your canal is neglected, your field dries. If your embankment fails, your work disappears underwater. If the silt builds up, the whole system gets cranky. And while the labour crews do their sweating and hauling, and muttering, another form of watching rises above them: the sky. A careful reading might suggest that this culture does not divide earthly danger from heavenly meaning as neatly as modern people often do. For a Sumerian city, water levels, crop growth, political fortune, and divine mood all belong to one great woven fabric. Priests do not simply recite nice words in a stylish robe and then go home feeling mysterious. Temples are part of administration, part ritual centre, part storage network, part cosmic listening post. When the land feels unstable, the heavens matter even more. This does not mean every cloud becomes a coded message, or every awkward goat sneeze counts as prophecy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. People in ancient Mesopotamia are not floating around in a permanent magical fog seeing omens in every spilled cup. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual and observation help structure uncertainty. When the world is difficult to predict, systems of meaning become valuable tools. They do not erase danger, but they give danger shape. You walk now in imagination along a canal bank at dawn. The mud is cool underfoot. Reeds tremble at the edges. Frogs mutter like tiny, disgruntled officials. Far off a temple platform catches the first pale light. A pair of workers shoulder baskets toward a field, while somewhere behind you a scribe squints over damp clay, already beginning the day's account. And above it all, the sky opens slowly, indifferent and enormous. One interpretation is that the people watching this sky are not merely curious about weather. They are trying to recognise patterns before disaster becomes obvious. If the river runs oddly, if the winds arrive wrong, if the stars appear in troubling relation, if the sacrificial signs read poorly, then perhaps action must be taken before ordinary life notices anything at all. This is not a claim of secret cosmic knowledge. That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is simply the logic of anxious systems. By the time danger is visible to everyone, it may already be too late. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian Omen traditions were primarily tools of political control, sincere religious practice, practical pattern, recognition, or some mix of all three. That argument matters because it shapes how you understand the strange tension in later stories. If Omen reading is just ceremonial theatre, then all this watching remains symbolic. If it is part of genuine statecraft, then the emotional atmosphere changes. Suddenly the temple and the palace are not merely reacting to disaster. They are scanning for it, reading signs, asking what may be coming. The evidence we do have points to a civilization deeply invested in anticipation, and anticipation has a mood. It is not the splash and chaos of floodwaters yet. It is quieter than that. It is the pause before the storm, but stretched over seasons, even generations. The grain is counted because shortage is possible. The canal is dredged because failure is possible. The offering is made because divine displeasure is possible. The stars are observed because disorder may first appear at a distance, faint and elegant, long before it arrives with mud on its feet. This is where some later mystery-minded readers begin leaning forward in their chairs, a little too eagerly, which is usually your cue to lean back. A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian traditions preserve memories not only of flood anxiety, but of celestial fear, as though the Anunnaki or the priestly culture around them sensed a threat beyond ordinary river disaster. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. We'll say so plainly. There is no tablet that politely tells you, attention, everyone was preparing for a vague mega-threat from the sky. Ancient texts inconveniently prefer poetry fragments and layered symbolism over clean modern briefings. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes more interesting when made smaller and softer. What if the people of Sumer did not fear one single event, but lived with a broader expectation that catastrophe could arrive from several directions at once? River, drought, disease, political unrest, crop collapse, unreadable omens, a season gone wrong, a king gone foolish, which, to be fair, is not only ancient history, it is also the basic human experience of trying to keep your life together while the universe keeps inventing new nonsense. That broader fear may matter more than any flashy theory, because once you understand how unstable the world feels, the later flood stories begin to shift in tone. Perhaps the flood is not merely a memory of water, but the largest symbol available for a whole category of helplessness. Water becomes the image because it is vivid, terrifying and immediate, but underneath it may lie something older and wider, the knowledge that the world can turn on you, and that all wise people can really do is watch, prepare record, and hope. So the watchers keep watching. From temple roofs, from courtyard shadows, from field edges, from riverbanks streaked with fresh silt. The smell of wet earth rises after a minor overflow. A child drags a reed toy through the mud. A woman measures grain into a jar. A foreman curses softly at a broken embankment. A priest looks toward the evening sky. None of them knows the future in the dramatic way modern rumour likes to imagine. But all of them live close to precarity, and that closeness changes the texture of every ordinary act. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is clear enough. Early Mesopotamian life requires constant management of risk. The interpretation is that this practical vigilance may have shaped how danger was later remembered in myth. And the imagined part, the calm what-if note that drifts at the edge of the lamp glow is this: what if some of the watchers believed the water was only the most visible warning, and the true threat had not yet shown its full face? The sky darkens now. The canal turns black and still. Somewhere a stylus taps clay again. Prepare, prepare, prepare. The tapping sound follows you into the next stretch of night, that tiny reed stylus rhythm, as if the whole city is scratching little warnings into wet clay while pretending it is only doing inventory. By now you can feel the shape of this world more clearly. It is flat, hot, river-fed, mud-built, and unbelievably dependent on systems that have to keep working every single day. Most historians agree that Sumerian cities did not emerge from comfort. They emerged from coordination. A city in southern Mesopotamia is not just a cluster of houses. It is a machine made of canals, labour gangs, levees, storehouses, temple courtyards, fields, carts, livestock, and a truly heroic amount of administrative patience. And because this machine is fragile, it builds against uncertainty. What's broadly accepted is that early Mesopotamian cities invested enormous effort in walls, waterworks, and storage. City walls could define space, express power, and offer defence. Canals moved water where it was needed and prevented fields from becoming useless stretches of cracked salt. Granaries and storehouses turned one good harvest into insurance against a bad season. None of that is mysterious. It is the plain old historical truth that survival tends to favour people who plan ahead, instead of shrugging at the horizon and saying, "I'm sure it'll be fine." Those are famous last words in every century. You walk now in imagination toward a city edge at first light. The wall is not elegant in the way later empires like to imagine themselves. It is practical, thick, earthen, and slightly rough. The sort of structure that says less, behold our timeless beauty, and more, please do not let chaos stroll in uninvited. Nearby men with baskets and wooden tools work a canal bank, hauling mud, patching weak spots, arguing in the universal human dialect of manual labour. The air smells of damp earth, animal hide, and the faint mineral tang of river water drying in the sun. Archaeology suggests that this labour was constant. Canals silt up, embankments slump, water does not politely flow where people wish it would. Fields can become overwatered, underwatered, or poisoned by creeping salinity if the system is mismanaged. A city that stops maintaining its landscape starts negotiating with decline almost immediately. The evidence we do have points to a society that understands this with impressive seriousness. If a place like Uruk or Ur or Lagash feels grand in your imagination, it is worth remembering that grandeur here rests on mud being moved by sweating human beings. That is the documented anchor. Now the interpretation begins to drift in, soft as dust on a warm breeze. One interpretation is that this practical architecture of survival shaped the emotional architecture of Sumerian myth. When you live by defensive walls, raised platforms, measured rations, and managed water, your stories may naturally imagine the world as something that periodically breaks its bounds. The built environment becomes a kind of psychology in brick form. Walls against invasion, yes. Levees against overflow, yes. Storage against famine, yes. But also a deep habit of assuming that something sooner or later will go wrong. Historians still argue whether the great building works of early Mesopotamia should be read mainly as signs of state formation, environmental adaptation, military need, or symbolic kingship. The likely answer, as usual, is some braided mix of all of them. Human societies rarely do things for only one reason, which is annoying if you enjoy neat theories and wonderful if you enjoy reality. A wall can defend, impress, organise, labour mark sacred space, and flatter a king all at once. A granary can store wealth, stabilise food supply, and make visible the power of the institution controlling it. A raised temple platform can be religiously meaningful while also being quite sensibly higher than the surrounding mud. And what if the story is pointing at something else? Not because walls and storehouses secretly prove some lost supernatural warning system. They do not. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is no solid evidence that Sumerian builders were constructing emergency infrastructure because divine beings had privately briefed them on a disaster worse than flood. That's a possibility some modern readers imagine, but it remains a debated and very speculative leap. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a quieter thought emerges. What if the scale of preparation itself tells us something about the mental climate of the place? Not a single event, not a single forecast, but a worldview. A city that builds as if tomorrow may betray it. A society that stores surplus because abundance is never trusted for long. A sacred and civic order built around the assumption that stability is temporary. You can feel that mood in the details. The raised threshold of a storage room, the careful stacking of jars, the brick revetment against water damage, the disciplined route of canal channels drawn across the plain like veins under skin. None of these things screams apocalypse. They whisper preparedness. They whisper in their own earthy and bureaucratic way that ordinary life survives by expecting interruption. A fringe idea proposes that later Anunnaki traditions may preserve memory of elite planning for layered catastrophe. Not just flood, but something broader perhaps, environmental, celestial or social. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because Mesopotamian civilization really did live amid multiple forms of instability. Flood was one, drought was another. Soil salinization could quietly reduce yields over time. Political conflict could break regional systems. Trade could falter. Temples and palaces could overreach. In that sense, something worse than the flood may not refer to one dramatic event at all. A more cautious explanation could be that it refers in symbolic language to the collapse of balance itself. And balance is everything here. You pass through a city gate in your mind, and the noise shifts. Inside sandals scuff packed earth. Donkeys complain like underpaid subcontractors. Somewhere, someone is grinding grain. Somewhere else, a child laughs, then immediately gets told to stop doing whatever child thing seemed excellent 5 seconds earlier. Above the rooftops rises the temple platform, watching over the city, not as a fairy tale castle, but as the visible centre of order. Administrative order, ritual order, economic order, cosmic order, if you're inclined to think that way, and most people here are. Archaeology suggests that temple and palace institutions became deeply intertwined with the practical work of organising resources. That matters because religious imagination in Sumer is not sealed off from the mechanics of life. The divine world and the managed world overlap. Gods receive offerings, yes, but temples also receive grain labour, livestock and manufactured goods. It is possible that stories of divine decision-making felt believable partly because real survival already depended on centralised planning. The gods of myth often act like magnified rulers because rulers, scribes, and priests are already shaping the material conditions of ordinary people. So when later stories picture divine beings measuring, assigning, deciding, sheltering, or withdrawing favour, the imagery fits a society used to top-down systems of survival. If we are careful, that does not mean the myths are coded reports. It means myth speaks in the language a culture already lives by. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is a landscape of walls, canals, and granaries. The interpretation is that such a landscape encourages stories of recurring danger and relentless preparation. The imagined part is the mood that settles over the city at dusk, when the wall throws a long shadow across the plain, and you wonder whether the strongest structures were built against threats people understood, or against fears they could sense but never quite name. The sun is lower now. Heat loosens from the brick. In the storehouses, grain waits. In the canals, water slides past in silence. On the high platform, a temple catches the last gold light, like a thought held above the earth. And under everything as steady as breath, the old instinct continues. Build, store, watch, repair. Prepare for what you know. Prepare for what you do not. Build, store, watch, repair. The rhythm settles into you now so thoroughly that even the temple steps seem to echo it. You move upward through a Sumerian city, not towards some abstract heaven, but toward administration wrapped in holiness. Most historians agree that temples in early Mesopotamia were not only sacred spaces, they were economic centres, labour organisers, storehouse managers, and public symbols of stability. If that sounds less like a mystical retreat and more like a very serious institution with incense, you are getting the mood exactly right. At the base of the platform, people come and go, carrying jars, baskets, seals, fish, reeds, wool, and questions. Always questions. How much grain is due? Which field has been assigned? Which worker receives rations? Which offering must be prepared? Which canal stretch needs labour? What's broadly accepted is that temple households could oversee large flows of goods and labour. This is not some side detail. It is central to how Sumerian cities function. And with all that measuring and assigning comes a certain tone. A civilization built on accounting begins to imagine the world itself as something measured. Archaeology suggests that numerical order mattered deeply in Mesopotamian administration. From land allotments to labour obligations to offerings, the evidence we do have points to a people who understood that chaos enters fastest where nobody is counting. So the temple counts, the scribes count, the granaries count, the overseers count, livestock jars, tools, workers, bushels, days. Even the gods in literary imagination can seem to participate in this mood of distribution and decree. One interpretation is that divine order in the myths feels persuasive because it mirrors institutional order on the ground. You stand now in imagination near a shaded courtyard inside a temple complex. The air is cooler here, touched by damp clay walls and the faint sweetness of old grain. A scribe bends over a tablet reed stylus, moving with the dry little patience of someone whose whole personality may now be wedge-shaped. Nearby, a supervisor checks deliveries. In another corner, a priest prepares a ritual. The two scenes do not contradict each other. They belong together. Sacred smoke rises beside administrative dust. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was deeply embedded in everyday governance rather than sealed away from it. The gods were not decorative ideas. They structured legitimacy, obligation, kingship, ritual, duty, and the moral mood of civic life. But historians still argue whether the divine language in Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts is best read mainly as theology, as political metaphor, as inherited poetic tradition, or as several things at once. That uncertainty matters more than it first appears, because when later readers encounter the Anunnaki in the texts, they often want a single answer. Are these purely mythic beings? Are they echoes of social hierarchy? Are they cosmic rulers in story form? Are they later misread as something far stranger? The truth, or rather the careful historical answer, is usually messier. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong within Mesopotamian religious tradition. They are part of a divine order, but the exact shades of meaning shift across time, place, genre, and text, which is where the mystery slips in, not as proof, not as revelation with dramatic music and a thumbnail trying way too hard. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not entitled to take every divine title literally and announce we have solved ancient history before bedtime. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and in most cases, not even the likeliest one. Still, a careful reading might suggest that stories of heavenly figures assigning roles, weighing outcomes, or determining survival gained their emotional power from a world already governed through measured distribution and top-down planning. If the temple decides who gets grain, then a mythic council of gods deciding the fate of cities feels hauntingly familiar. If an institution stores surplus against bad years, then divine stories about foreknowledge and preparation feel less random. If scribes turn uncertainty into lists, then heavenly order may also be imagined as something counted, assigned and preserved against disruption. A fringe idea proposes that later stories of the Anunnaki preserve memory of elite planners preparing for something larger than ordinary disaster. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because the literary imagery of divine management can sound to modern ears almost logistical. Be careful though, modern ears are not neutral instruments. They love pattern. They love secret plans. They love turning gods into project managers with a crisis calendar. The more cautious explanation could be that human institutions gave shape to divine imagination, not the other way around. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if these texts preserve not hidden technology or forbidden briefings, but an emotional truth? A city survives because someone is always measuring risk. Someone is always preparing for shortage. Someone is always trying to keep chaos outside the gate and outside the granary and outside the prayer hall. In that light, the Anunnaki need not be literal engineers of catastrophe to carry the atmosphere of preparation. They may instead embody a civilization's sense that order is fragile and must be maintained from above, from beyond, from anywhere strength can be found. The mood of this temple helps. You can hear it in the scrape of baskets on the floor, in the hush that falls before ritual words are spoken, in the low complaint of a worker shifting a heavy jar in the flutter of pigeons, from some high ledge in the stylus tapping clay again. Tick, tick, tick. It is almost funny how much ancient civilization depends on clerical endurance. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey brays with the confidence of a creature who has contributed nothing to theology, and yet feels qualified to comment anyway. Archaeology suggests that temples also worked as places of storage and redistribution, which means they were physically tied to abundance and scarcity alike. That detail matters because grain oil, wool, and labour are not abstract here. They are the difference between continuity and strain. The temple does not merely symbolise order, it helps produce it. One interpretation is that this institutional role may have influenced later traditions in which divine realms appear concerned with who gets what, who endures, and who does not. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the temple economy, the scribes, the rations, the managed labour. The interpretation is that divine order in myth may echo civic order in practice. The imagined part is this soft cinematic question hovering in the lamplight. If the earthly accountants are already bracing for uncertainty, what kind of fear might the heavenly stories enlarge? Historians still argue whether divine councils in Mesopotamian literature reflect cosmic belief, royal ideology, inherited narrative convention, or collective memory shaped into sacred drama. That debate will not fully settle tonight, and honestly, it would be rude of it to do so. Mysteries this old prefer layers, but as you stand in the temple's shade and feel the stored coolness of mud brick against the heat outside, one thing becomes hard to ignore. The people who built these institutions were not casual optimists. They measured because measurement mattered. They recorded because memory mattered. They offered because favour mattered. And perhaps, in ways both practical and poetic, they prepared because instability always seemed one season away. The platform rises over the plain. The canals gleam. The storehouses wait in shadow. In the clay below your fingertips, every tiny wedge is both a mark of control and an admission that control might fail. And that is where the atmosphere deepens. Because once a civilization imagines order as something counted and guarded, it becomes easier to imagine disaster, not as an accident, but as a verdict, a breach, or a warning no one could afford to ignore. Because once you begin to imagine disaster as something larger than bad luck, the river itself starts to feel different, not just as water, but as memory. You stand now at the edge of that memory where the reeds lean over a slow brown current, and the evening light turns the canal surface into hammered bronze. Most historians agree that flood stories in Mesopotamia are rooted at least in part in real environmental experience. Rivers in this region could nourish cities, ruin fields, swallow boundaries, and reorder entire stretches of human effort in a matter of days. Archaeology suggests that flooding channel shifts and water instability were recurring realities, not rare spectacles. So when Mesopotamian literature later tells stories of overwhelming water, it is not inventing fear from scratch. It is giving familiar fear a grand stage. That much is solid ground. But once a flood becomes story, it also becomes symbol, and symbols, as usual, refuse to sit quietly in one corner like well-behaved house guests. One interpretation is that the great flood traditions preserve more than the memory of water alone. A careful reading might suggest that flood language in Mesopotamian storytelling became a container for broader anxieties, the kind that are difficult to describe in ordinary speech. Crop failure can be named. Political collapse can be named. Disease can be named, at least in its symptoms. But total instability, the feeling that the world itself has become unreliable, is harder to pin down. What if the flood became the image because it was the clearest way to picture everything breaking at once? You can see why it would work. Water crosses borders without asking. It enters doors, swallows fields, lifts roofs, changes maps, and turns carefully measured order into drifting debris. If you are a civilization built on counted grain, assigned labour, raised storehouses and maintained canals, then uncontrolled water is the perfect opposite of the life you have worked so hard to build. It is anti-administration, anti-boundary, anti-schedule, basically the river equivalent of someone replying all to an email chain with 12 attachments and no explanation. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood narratives, especially in later Akkadian literature, connected to older Sumerian themes, participate in a long tradition of explaining catastrophe through divine human tension. The gods decide, a warning is given, a survivor prepares, life continues after overwhelming loss. Historians still argue whether these stories should be read mainly as theological reflection, literary inheritance, cultural memory of local flood events, or some combination of all three. That debate matters here because the more you look at flood as symbol, the more the old question begins to shift. Maybe the flood is not the whole disaster. Maybe it is the face of disaster people can bear to talk about. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is no direct evidence that Sumerian scribes were secretly coding a larger unknown threat behind every mention of water. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and often not the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is usually that rivers were terrifying enough on their own. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the emotional structure of the stories becomes interesting. They do not only say that water came, they say that warning mattered, preparation mattered, survival depended on recognizing danger before everyone else understood it. And that is where the flood begins to brush against the atmosphere surrounding the Anunnaki theories, even if only very lightly. A fringe idea proposes that stories involving divine counsels, warnings, and preserved life might reflect preparation for a danger broader than flood itself. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains traction among mystery-minded readers because the narrative pattern feels larger than one local event. Someone knows, someone hesitates, someone preserves knowledge, seed life, or order. From a mainstream historical view, this is better understood as mythic storytelling shaped by real ecological danger and religious imagination. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers simply overextend a powerful symbol. Still, the symbol keeps opening. You walk now in imagination through a low quarter of the city after a hard rise in the water. The mud is thicker underfoot. Reed mats hang damp. A storage jar has toppled. Children have been called indoors. A worker stands staring at a bank that held yesterday and failed today. There is no dramatic orchestra, only the sticky silence that follows disruption. The smell is sour river water mixed with trampled straw and fresh clay. This is how catastrophe usually introduces itself, not as spectacle, but as inconvenience becoming fear. Archaeology suggests that early urban communities in southern Mesopotamia were vulnerable not only to major flooding, but to the cumulative effects of water mismanagement and environmental pressure. That is important because it widens the picture. Disaster here is not always one giant event. Sometimes it is repeated stress, leaky embankments, poor drainage, salty fields, failed maintenance, a season slightly off, then another. One interpretation is that myths compress these ongoing pressures into a single memorable drama. Instead of telling a tale about 40 small failures and 3 bad crop cycles, you tell one tale about the waters rising beyond all human control. That kind of compression is not deception. It is how human memory often works. It gathers scattered fears and gives them one face. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if behind the flood image there is an older human recognition that certain dangers cannot be isolated neatly? Water may arrive first, but it brings hunger, migration, labour, strain, conflict, disease, and theological panic with it. The flood is visible, but the larger threat is systemic unravelling. If so, then the later question of whether someone divine or human was preparing for something worse than the flood begins to sound less outrageous and more like a poetic way of asking whether ancient people feared collapse itself. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature often links environmental crisis to moral and cosmic order. The gods are not passive weather reporters. They are woven into the explanation of why disaster happens and why survival is selective. That theological structure can feel strange to modern readers, but in Sumer and later Mesopotamia, it makes sense within a world where politics, ecology, and divine order are all entangled. You do not separate them neatly because daily life does not separate them neatly. So if later traditions place divine beings in scenes of warning judgment and preservation, one interpretation is not that they are recording a literal disaster committee, but that they are dramatising a worldview in which power from above responds to human instability below. The Anunnaki in that reading do not need to be literal planners to carry the emotional charge of planning. They become figures through whom the civilization imagines preparedness, distance authority, and troubling foresight. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know floods mattered. We know water shaped cities. We know memory turned disaster into story. What we cannot fully confirm is how much of that story is simple recollection. How much is theology and how much is a deeper cultural habit of imagining that the visible catastrophe always hints at something wider and harder to name. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the unstable river world of Mesopotamia. The interpretation is that flood stories may also preserve memory of broader social and environmental anxiety. The imagined part is the quiet scene, now settling in your mind, a temple lamp flickering above a dark canal, a scribe drying a tablet near the wall, and beyond the reed beds the sense almost too faint to catch, that the water itself is only the message people were able to remember, because perhaps that is the trick of old stories. They do not always tell you the whole fear directly. Sometimes they give you the part you can survive hearing. Sometimes they give you the part you can survive hearing and leave the rest up in the sky. That is where you find yourself now, looking upward with the people of ancient Mesopotamia, where darkness gathers slowly over the plain and the first stars begin to appear above canals, rooftops, and temple terraces. Most historians agree that celestial observation played an important role in Mesopotamian religious and political life, especially in later periods where Omen traditions become richly documented, though the roots of skywatching stretch back deep into the older cultures of the region. What's broadly accepted is that the heavens were not merely pretty decoration, they mattered. They signalled timing, ritual, order, kingship, agricultural rhythm, and sometimes danger. And once the sky matters, it becomes hard to look at it casually. You stand in imagination on a high platform after sunset. The mud brick city below is fading into shadow. A few lamps flicker in courtyards. Somewhere someone is coughing. Somewhere else someone is muttering over a stubborn donkey, which, to be fair, is a very ancient and honourable human tradition. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of dust, river damp, and distant cooking fires. Above you, the stars sharpen one by one as if the night has decided to start filing reports. One interpretation is that for the people who watched this sky celestial order, and earthly survival belonged to the same conversation. A careful reading might suggest that unusual events overhead, whether eclipses, strange planetary movements, or simply unsettling patterns in the expected rhythm, could feed anxieties already present on the ground. If your world is fragile, the heavens do not feel separate from that fragility. They feel like part of the warning system. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian societies, particularly through priestly and scholarly traditions, developed a strong habit of correlating observed signs with political and environmental outcomes. The evidence we do have points to a culture that took patterns seriously, not because they were irrational in some lazy modern caricature, but because pattern recognition is exactly what you do when survival depends on anticipating disruption. A river rise, a crop decline, an odd wind, an eclipse, a poor omen from sacrifice, a nervous king, a failed embankment. In a tightly managed world, everything begins to look connected because quite often it is. Historians still argue whether Omen traditions in Mesopotamia were primarily sincere attempts to understand divine will, practical forms of elite risk management, political theatre, or a layered combination of all three. That is the exact kind of argument ancient evidence loves to provoke, and frankly, it is not hard to see why. A priest reading signs in the sky may genuinely believe he is hearing the structure of the cosmos. A ruler consulting him may genuinely fear disaster. The same consultation may also strengthen authority, justify decisions, calm public nerves, and create the helpful impression that someone somewhere is still in charge. Human systems rarely settle for doing only one thing at a time. They multitask, especially when worried. Most historians agree that kings in Mesopotamia often relied on divinatory knowledge and ritual expertise as part of governance. That fact matters here because it shows that watching the sky was not just dreamy stargazing with a mystical vibe and excellent night air. It could influence real decisions, timing, ritual response, public action, political mood. If an unsettling sign appeared overhead, it might not stay overhead for long. It could descend into administration. And that is where the section's quiet little tension begins. Because if a society already lives with floods, drought, salinity, labour strain, and fragile canals, then an ominous sky does not feel like an abstract theological puzzle. It feels personal. It feels immediate. It feels like one more front in the long campaign to keep order from falling apart. One interpretation is that the repeated attention given to heavenly signs may reflect a civilization that expects warning to arrive before disaster fully shows itself. That does not mean the warning is clear. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient Omen language does not hand you a modern forecast bulletin saying trouble incoming, please remain calm, and stock extra barley. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and usually much too neat for the evidence. What we actually have are traditions in which signs are read, debated, responded to, and folded into a broader worldview of instability and divine order. A fringe idea proposes that unusual sky-focused traditions may hint that ancient peoples feared something beyond ordinary flood cycles. Perhaps a celestial or cosmic disruption remembered only in distorted form. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because sky omens already occupy such an important emotional place in Mesopotamian thought. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory becomes less about literal alien warnings or hidden science fiction and more about atmospheric fear. What if the night sky itself came to symbolize the sense that danger might arrive from beyond immediate human control? That wider feeling matters more than the flashy version. You can picture it in the stillness of the platform. A priest lifts his face toward a strange alignment. A ruler waits below for interpretation. A scribe prepares to preserve the result on clay. The city sleeps uneasily beneath them, not because anyone has secret knowledge of a precise disaster, but because uncertainty itself has become a discipline. Watch closely, record carefully, act cautiously, prepare even when the shape of danger is not yet fully visible. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Worse Than the Flood is not one spectacular event at all, but the terrifying possibility that disruption could come from multiple directions, some from the river, plain below, some from the political world of kings, and some from the heavens that gave time order and warning? A more cautious explanation could be that later readers simply projected too much mystery into routine religious practice. Fair enough. That risk is real, but even routine religious practice can reveal the emotional architecture of a civilization, and here the architecture is built around vigilance. The evidence we do have points to a people who wanted signs before catastrophe, not merely explanations after it. That desire is deeply human. You feel it now, even in your own life, though probably with fewer reed styluses and more tabs open than necessary. You want to know before things go wrong. You want the warning early. You want the world to be legible. Ancient Mesopotamia shares that wish in clay smoke, stars and ritual. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the importance of celestial signs, Omen culture, and the political use of ritual knowledge. The interpretation is that this sky watching may reflect a broader habit of anticipating layered danger. The imagined part is the scene above you now, where the stars seem almost too sharp over the darkened city and every bright point feels less like decoration than a question. Below the canals hold the last faint light. Above constellations take their places with patient indifference. In between stands the city built of mud and hope. A measured grain, listening upward as if the sky might reveal whether the next threat will come, with water, wind, silence, or something no one yet has words for. And so the watching continues, not only at the riverbank, not only in the granary, but in the restless dark above. And so the watching continues not only in the restless dark above, but in the sealed earthy stillness below where grain waits in shadow, and every full storage room feels like both a triumph and a confession. Most historians agree that surplus grain storage was essential to the survival of Sumerian cities. That is not glamorous, but it is civilization in one of its purest forms. A good harvest means very little if it cannot be collected, protected, measured and redistributed when the season turns bad. Archaeology suggests that temples and large institutions in Mesopotamia were deeply involved in storing and managing food resources, along with oil, wool, and other staples. What's broadly accepted is that abundance was never treated as permanent. It had to be captured, counted, and defended from spoilage, theft, and bad luck, which is another way of saying that the city expects trouble. You walk now, in imagination, into a storage space attached to a temple household, and the air changes immediately. Outside, the late-day heat still clings to the brick, but here, inside, it is cooler, thick, with the dry smell of grain dust, clay bins, old reeds, and the faint sweetness of dates. Light comes in, narrow and slanting. A worker shifts a basket. Another seals a jar. A scribe presses marks into clay to record what has entered and what must not disappear. Somewhere nearby, a rat is almost certainly planning something disrespectful. One interpretation is that storehouses are the emotional heart of urban fear. Not the floodplain, not the sky, not even the wall, but the quiet room where people try to outwit the future by stacking food against it. Because a full granary is never just food. It is time. It is patience made material. It is an argument against uncertainty. It says that someone believed tomorrow might become difficult and chose not to leave the matter entirely to prayer. The evidence we do have points to a landscape of recurring risk where this kind of preparation made sense. Flooding could destroy crops. Drought could reduce yield. Salinity could weaken agricultural productivity over time. Labour shortages conflict, or administrative strain could interrupt normal flows of goods. A more cautious explanation could be that large storage systems simply reflect normal institutional efficiency in a demanding environment. That is probably true. But efficiency in a demanding environment is already a form of organised anxiety just dressed in better accounting. Historians still argue whether patterns of surplus accumulation in early Mesopotamia are best explained by redistributive necessity, elite extraction, temple power, risk management, or some ever-annoying combination of all four. As usual, the answer is probably mixed. Temples gathered goods because they could. Rulers and institutions benefited from controlling supply. Workers were fed through these systems. Communities survived through them. None of that excludes the possibility that people also saw storage as a moral and cosmic act, a bulwark against the known fragility of life. In a world where the land can fail, you stored grain begins to feel almost sacred. And once something feels sacred, stories begin attaching themselves to it. A fringe idea proposes that unusual patterns of accumulation in Mesopotamian tradition hint at preparation for disasters larger than ordinary famine or flood. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. There is no surviving tablet that says, "We are stocking up because something unspeakably worse is coming. Please pass the barley." Ancient records are usually much less dramatic and much more irritatingly practical. They tell you quantities, destinations, obligations, and occasionally the kind of detail that makes you realise humanity has always loved paperwork far more than storytelling. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the mood around storage becomes interesting. What if these full rooms were not merely symbols of wealth or routine planning, but reminders that the city did not trust the future, not in a theatrical cloak-swirling way, in the ordinary, sober way of people who know that systems fail. You see it in the seals pressed onto containers, in the careful lists, in the elevated floors, in the division of goods by category and purpose. The architecture of storage says the same thing. The canal system says the same thing. The temple says the same thing the sky watchers say. Prepare. Most historians agree that storing grain was a basic necessity in agrarian states, but a careful reading might suggest that in Mesopotamia, the act took on a deeper cultural charge because the margin between stability and strain could be so narrow. One bad season, one damaged canal, one administrative misstep, one outbreak of conflict, and suddenly what looked like comfort turns into rationing. So the full granary is also a warning. It is full because emptiness is imaginable. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the old traditions that later link divine beings to human survival are not about miraculous rescue from a single disaster, but about a civilization that had already made preparation into a sacred habit? In that light, the Anunnaki do not need to be literal stockpilers or secret planners. They may function instead as magnified figures of order, the kind of beings who belong naturally in stories where the fate of crop cities and continuity hangs on whether someone saw danger early enough to act. That is speculative, of course. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not claiming that Sumerian storehouses prove a hidden Anunnaki survival program. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and not a mainstream one. but it may raise the possibility that later myths preserve the emotional truth of a society constantly preparing for more than one kind of breakdown. The visible flood is one threat. Hunger is another. Administrative failure is another. Social unravelling is another. Once you live inside that web, something worse than the flood may simply mean a crisis that makes all those dangers arrive together. The quietness of the storehouse helps you feel that. Outside, the city moves in sunlight and noise. Inside, the air is still enough that you can hear grain shift inside a bin with the softest settling whisper. You can smell chaff. You can see the dust floating in a shaft of light. You can almost imagine the hands that filled the baskets, the backs that bent in the fields, the arguments over allotments, the prayers that hovered over harvest. This room is full not only of barley and dates, but of deferred panic. A popular rumour claims that ancient temple stores sometimes hid secret provisions for elites in times of catastrophe. Such stories tend to grow larger in retelling, and the direct evidence is usually frustratingly incomplete. A more cautious explanation could be that institutions always privilege certain groups first, because institutions, ancient and modern, are annoyingly consistent in that regard. But even that ordinary explanation adds to the atmosphere. Storage is never neutral. It reflects power, fear, and decisions about who gets protected when resources tighten. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the central role of grain storage in Mesopotamian survival. The interpretation is that surplus accumulation may also reflect a deeper cultural expectation of disruption. The imagined part is the feeling settling around you now as the light fades in the storage room and the clay jars line the wall, like patient witnesses, as though the city has been rehearsing scarcity for so long that abundance itself begins to feel temporary. And that may be the most unnerving thing of all. Not that ancient people feared one giant disaster, but that they were wise enough to suspect disaster rarely travels alone. So the bins are filled, the seals are pressed, the lists are checked again. In the hush of the storehouse, the city's oldest prayer becomes almost indistinguishable from its oldest strategy. Count what remains, guard what matters, and be ready when the ordinary world decides once again to become unreliable. Count what remains, guard what matters. Be ready when the ordinary world decides once again to become unreliable. That instinct rises with you now as you leave the cool granary and step back into the temple complex, where order is not only stored but performed, repeated and remembered. Most historians agree that temples in Sumer were more than religious buildings. They were administrative hubs, ritual centres, storehouses, workshops, and symbols of cosmic legitimacy planted right in the middle of urban life. Archaeology suggests that temple institutions helped organise labour goods offerings and collective memory. What's broadly accepted is that these places were designed not just to worship order, but to embody it. And once a society starts embodying order in brick ritual and record, the temple begins to feel almost like a machine for holding chaos at bay. You move upward again in imagination, climbing worn steps that have known thousands of sandaled feet. The mud brick surface is warm from the day. Below, the city spreads in low roofs and courtyards, canals catching thin strips of evening light. Above the platform rises into air that feels cleaner, as though elevation itself might somehow improve the odds. The temple stands there with the calm seriousness of a building that has never once apologised for being important. One interpretation is that temples worked as memory machines. Not memory in the sentimental sense, but memory made operational. They preserve offerings, preserve lists, preserve authority, preserve ritual sequence, preserve names, preserve obligations, preserve the idea that the world can be stabilised if every proper action is repeated correctly. The evidence we do have points to a civilization deeply invested in repetition as protection. If the canal must be dredged again, dredge it again. If the offering must be made again, make it again. If the hymn must be recited again, recite it again. If the ration must be counted again, count it again. Continuity is not assumed, it is manufactured. And manufacturing continuity, as it turns out, is exhausting. You can hear that exhaustion in the quiet little sounds of temple life. A broom dragging over packed earth. A basket set down more heavily than intended. The dry flick of a stylus against clay. The whisper of linen. The low chant of a ritual spoken not with dramatic thunder, but with the patient tone of people who know that the world needs maintenance, and apparently the gods do too. Somewhere in the courtyard, a pigeon lands with the useless confidence of a creature contributing nothing to institutional survival, and yet behaving as if it runs the place. Archaeology suggests that temples also acted as repositories of social knowledge. Accounts, offerings, cult practice, land arrangements, labour systems, and the visible rhythms of sacred life all gathered there. That matters because memory in early cities is not only carried in human minds, it is distributed into institutions. One careful reading might suggest that the temple teaches the city how to endure, by teaching it how to remember in structured ways. Historians still argue whether the deepest symbolic language of Mesopotamian temples records ritual theology alone, civic administration, wrapped in sacred form, collective trauma, processed through repeated ceremony, or some layered combination of all three. That debate matters more than it first seems. Because if temples are only ritual sites, then repetition is mainly devotional. If they are also civic engines of continuity, then repetition becomes a survival technology. Light the lamp, store the grain, recite the hymn, track the labour, repair the wall, make the offering, maintain the canal. These are not separate worlds. They are one braided answer to precarity. And once you see that the atmosphere around the great questions shifts again, what if the story is pointing at something else? Not secret machinery buried under the temple floor, not a hidden bunker for divine elites with extremely organised grain preferences. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is no mainstream evidence that Sumerian temples were designed as emergency shelters for some literal class of Anunnaki beings preparing for a catastrophe beyond the flood. That's a possibility modern mystery culture sometimes toys with, but the evidence is thin and the leap is large. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something subtler appears. What if temple life preserves the emotional structure of preparation? A high place above the plane, a centre of storage and ritual, a location where signs are read, goods are gathered, continuity is guarded, and the world is symbolically restitched every day. In that sense, the temple already behaves like a place built against unravelling, not because it expects one cinematic apocalypse on a fixed date, but because it assumes disorder is always near. Most historians agree that high temple platforms and sacred precincts serve symbolic and institutional purposes, but one interpretation is that they may also have offered a psychological model of endurance, rise above, preserve order, remember what matters, repeat what stabilizes. In a floodplain world, that symbolism would not feel abstract. Height matters, storage matters, visibility matters, ritual timing matters. A city below can wobble, the platform above must look steady. The temple therefore becomes a kind of public reassurance. The lists are still being written, the lamps are still being lit, the offerings are still being brought. The gods, or at least the system speaking in their name, have not stopped keeping count. And if divine figures like the Anunnaki later appear in stories connected to judgment order or the management of fate, it is possible that they inherit some of this atmosphere. They become part of a memory architecture shaped by institutions that existed precisely to prevent panic from replacing routine. A fringe idea proposes that repeated emphasis on sacred elevation in Mesopotamian tradition hints at concern over threats that might overwhelm the lowlands, whether flood war or something broader. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because elevation in the plane has obvious practical and symbolic force. A more cautious explanation could be that raised sacred space is common for many reasons, including visibility, authority, and religious distinction. That is likely true, but practical and symbolic reasons often work together, especially in a land where the horizon itself feels unstable. You stand now at the edge of the platform in the cooling dark. The city below is quieter. One lamp moves through a courtyard. Another glows near a storage room. Farther off, a canal reflects a broken line of moonlight. The air smells faintly of oil dust and river damp. The temple behind you seems less like a building than a held breath that has lasted for generations. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the temple's central role in administration, ritual, and memory. The interpretation is that these institutions may have helped communities process recurring instability by turning order into a repeated public act. The imagined part is the mood gathering here now, where the platform above the sleeping city feels like a rehearsal space for endurance, as though every stair, every tablet, every measured offering is quietly asking the same question. If the waters rise, what survives? If the fields fail, what survives? If kings falter, what survives? If something worse than the flood ever pressed against the edge of human understanding, what survives? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the temple stood at the centre of Sumerian life. We know they stored, counted, directed, and remembered. What we cannot fully confirm is how much of their symbolic weight grew from ordinary governance, and how much also carried the deeper human fear that continuity itself is fragile. Below the city sleeps in mud brick rows. Above the temple keeps its silent watch, and in that silence memory becomes architecture. Not merely a record of what has been, but a practice for whatever comes next. Not merely a record of what has been, but a practice for whatever comes next. That feeling lingers as you leave the temple height behind and return in thought to the stories themselves, to the names moving through Mesopotamian tradition, like figures glimpsed through smoke. The Anunnaki arrive here not as clean modern characters, not as a tidy cast list with matching biographies and an excellent public relations team, but as divine beings whose roles shift across texts, centuries, and contexts. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki belong within the religious world of ancient Mesopotamia. What's broadly accepted is that they are part of a larger divine order, associated in different ways with authority, fate, the underworld, cosmic structure, and the layered imagination of myth. That is the documented ground, or at least the firmer part of it. The less firm part begins the moment later readers try to make them too literal. You can almost watch it happen across modern retellings. The Anunnaki become rulers, engineers, invaders, benefactors, planners, survivors, conspirators, and occasionally the victims of whatever theory has most recently wandered in wearing dramatic boots. A popular rumour claims they were not gods in the literary and religious sense at all, but flesh and blood advanced beings preparing for catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, very thin in fact. Ancient texts are full of divine language because they are religious and literary texts. That is the first thing to keep hold of before the mist gets ambitious. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not taking symbolic beings from myth and flattening them into a simple historical report. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and most historians would say it is not the strongest reading. Still, one interpretation is that the emotional role of the Anunnaki in some traditions may preserve a cultural memory of distant authority beings or powers above ordinary human life, whose decisions shape survival, scarcity, and fate. Even if that authority is theological rather than literal, the emotional pattern matters, because in a society built on top-down systems of grain, labour, ritual, and omen reading, divine figures who oversee outcomes do not feel random, they feel structurally familiar. You move now through the imagined texture of those stories. Temple smoke, night wind over the plain, clay tablets drying on shelves, a priest reciting lines whose meanings are already old, a scribe copying names passed down across generations. The divine world is not distant in the modern sense. It folds into politics, agriculture, justice, and cosmic anxiety. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion was woven into daily life at every level, from household practice to royal legitimacy. The evidence we do have points to a world in which the sacred and the practical constantly overlap. So, when the Anunnaki appear in that world, it is possible they carry more than one function at once. They are gods within the tradition. They are literary presences. They are symbolic authorities. They may also act as narrative containers for the very old human experience of living under systems you do not fully control. Historians still argue whether references to divine councils and beings like the Anunnaki should be read chiefly as inherited mythic convention, theological imagination, political analogy, or some shifting combination depending on the text. That uncertainty is annoying if you want a single grand conclusion, and excellent if you are willing to sit with layered meanings. And tonight, sitting with layered meanings is exactly the point. Because if we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, a clearer possibility emerges. The Anunnaki may not represent secret historical planners in any literal sense, but they may preserve the atmosphere of planning judgment and distant decision-making that shaped Mesopotamian life. One careful reading might suggest that later mystery theories only become persuasive because the original tradition already places powerful beings above humanity in a world where catastrophe is always near enough to matter. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if instead of asking whether the Anunnaki were real in some flattened modern way, you ask what kind of fear they help organise? A civilization that measures grain, watches the rivers, reads the sky, and stores surplus against uncertainty may naturally imagine divine powers who also oversee thresholds of survival. Who lives? Who receives warning? Who is passed over? Who rebuilds? In that sense, the Anunnaki become less like science fiction administrators and more like mythic expressions of a world where order always feels conditional. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki stories preserve memory of elite preparation for a vast catastrophe larger than the famous flood. Again, this theory is not widely accepted. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though the interesting part is not whether there was a hidden master plan. The interesting part is that Mesopotamian culture produced stories in which power above humanity is concerned with thresholds, crisis, and continuity. That by itself tells you something about the civilization's mental weather. And the mental weather here is not carefree. You feel it in the old motifs repeating like soft footsteps through the night. Decision from above. Warning before disaster. Survival of a remnant. Preservation of order. Withdrawal of favour. Rebuilding after ruin. These are not proof of one secret event. A more cautious explanation could be that these are simply common mythic structures in a culture acquainted with instability, but simply does a lot of work there. Common mythic structures are not trivial. They grow from real emotional conditions. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are not modern historical reports. They use divine drama, symbolic action, and inherited narrative patterns. But myths are not meaningless fantasy either. They tell you what a culture worries, about what it values, and how it imagines survival. If the Anunnaki keep appearing in stories of order, fate, and disruption, one interpretation is that they stand where human beings place the powers that seem to govern what they cannot fully master. You pause now in imagination beside a shelf of drying tablets. Some are whole, some are chipped, some are little more than fragments, the textual equivalent of someone beginning a very important message and then losing the rest under a couch for 4,000 years. The clay smells damp and mineral rich. A lamp burns low. Somewhere nearby, a reed bundle brushes lightly against the wall. In this dimness, the Anunnaki feel less like headline material and more like presences in a very old thought world, heavy with ritual administration and unease. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the place of the Anunnaki within Mesopotamian religious tradition. The interpretation is that their narrative role may reflect human anxieties about distant authority and fragile order. The imagined part is the quiet mood now settling over the tablets, where the names of divine beings seem to hover over the sleeping city, not as proof of hidden history, but as shadows cast by a civilization always preparing for judgments. It could sense more easily than it could explain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the Anunnaki mattered in the literary and religious imagination. We cannot fully confirm how every audience understood them or how many layers of social memory and symbolic fear had already gathered around their names. But perhaps that uncertainty is fitting, because beings associated with fate, authority, and cosmic order should never become too easy to explain. If they did, they would stop feeling ancient, and they would stop feeling dangerous in the quiet, sleepy way that truly old stories still can. And they would stop feeling dangerous in the quiet, sleepy way that truly old stories still can, which brings you at last to one of the strangest companions in this journey. Not the flood, not the temple, not even the Anunnaki themselves, but the break in the text. Most historians agree that a great deal of Mesopotamian writing survives only in fragments. What's broadly accepted is that tablets crack, edges crumble, signs fade, shelves collapse, cities burn, libraries scatter, and time behaves like a goat in a pottery shop. Archaeology suggests that much of what we know about Sumerian and later Mesopotamian literature has been reconstructed from incomplete remains, sometimes from pieces found far apart, sometimes from damaged copies made centuries after the original composition. The evidence we do have points to a record that is rich but never whole, and that incompleteness matters more than people sometimes realise. You stand now in imagination over a work table, where broken tablets lie beside one another like pieces of a thought that never quite made it across the millennia intact. One corner preserves a divine name, another preserves a list of offerings, another keeps only the middle of a sentence, the beginning and ending, lost to dust. A scribe in the ancient world once knew how it all fit together. You do not. You arrive late, polite, curious, and missing half the conversation. One interpretation is that the gaps themselves create the modern mystery almost as much as the surviving words do. A careful reading might suggest that many bold theories about Mesopotamia grow not from what the tablets clearly say, but from what they fail to explain fully once broken. Where the clay stops, imagination starts jogging. Sometimes it jogs responsibly, sometimes it sprints straight into a hedge. Historians still argue whether certain famous or frequently quoted fragments have been overinterpreted because modern readers underestimate just how much context has been lost. That argument is not only fair, it is necessary, because broken evidence can seduce you into certainty if you are not careful. A surviving phrase about God's warning destruction or preservation can look electrifying when lifted out of context. But context is often the very thing ancient damage removes first. A divine council might be part of a ritual hymn, a royal inscription, a cosmological tradition, a poetic lament, or a copied school text. The same line can feel very different depending on the whole it once belonged to. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not reading every damaged line as a hidden disclosure about a disaster beyond the flood. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and usually not the most cautious interpretation. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the fragments become interesting in a different way. Not because they prove a secret, but because they preserve the outline of fears too old and damaged to recover neatly. That outline is often enough to stir the imagination. A god's name, a warning, a decision from above, a mention of offering survival, building, measuring destruction or lament, a break, a silence, a missing edge. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And broken clay has a very efficient way of teaching that lesson. You can see it now in the lamplight. The tablet surface is rough where it snapped. The wedge marks stop abruptly at the fracture line, each sign cut in half like a thought interrupted mid-breath. Dust gathers in the little angles of the script. Your fingers, if you touch the surface in imagination, feel the dry grain of baked earth. Somewhere in that missing section there may once have been a clarifying phrase, a dull administrative note, a ritual formula, or absolutely nothing dramatic at all. Modern mystery culture loves to assume the missing part is always the good part. Ancient evidence, unfortunately, is under no obligation to entertain us. Still, the missing parts do shape the atmosphere of this subject. A fringe idea proposes that certain gaps in Mesopotamian texts conceal references to extraordinary threats or preparations no later tradition preserved clearly. This theory isn't widely accepted, and for good reason. Gaps cannot speak for themselves. A missing line is not automatic permission to insert whatever theory has the most exciting thumbnail. A more cautious explanation could be that the missing material was ordinary repetitive or contextually clarifying rather than sensational. That is often the likelier answer. But even when the conservative answer is best, the emotional effect of fragmentary evidence remains powerful. Because fragments mirror the thing we have been circling all night: partial warning, partial knowledge, partial preparation. A civilization watches the rivers, reads the sky stores. The grain raises the temple, names the gods, and still does not get complete certainty. Neither do we. Their world was incomplete to them in real time. Ours is incomplete in retrospect. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian literature was copied, adapted, translated, and reshaped over long stretches of time. That means even surviving tablets often reflect traditions already filtered through schools, priestly communities, scribal habits, and changing political worlds. One interpretation is that this layered transmission may explain why some stories feel like they preserve old anxieties in softened or stylized form. The flood may preserve many floods. The divine warning may preserve many moments of danger. The surviving text may preserve an older fear only in outline. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the haunting quality of these tablets lies not in one decoded message, but in the repeated pattern of partial survival? Just as grain is stored against loss, writing is stored against forgetting. Just as temples rise above the plane, tablets rise above time, though only barely. And just as myths preserve the emotional shape of danger, rather than a neat report, fragments preserve the emotional shape of memory, rather than a full archive. That possibility matters for the Anunnaki question too. If later readers imagine divine beings preparing for something worse than the flood, they may be responding not only to what the texts say, but to how the texts survive. Broken, suggestive, layered, incomplete. The form itself invites a certain kind of reading. You feel the edge of something larger. You suspect continuity. You lack closure. It is almost tailor-made for speculation, which is both fascinating and, academically speaking, slightly exhausting. You move now through a dim archival room in imagination. Shelves of clay sit in shadow. Some tablets are catalogued. Some are piled. Some have survived almost whole. Others a little more than corners with a few signs. The room smells of dust, oil, and old earth. The silence is thick enough that the scratch of a stylus from another chamber seems impossibly loud. Here broken records feel less like failures and more like survivors themselves. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the fragmentary state of much Mesopotamian evidence. The interpretation is that missing context may encourage modern theories, while also preserving traces of older, less recoverable anxieties. The imagined part is the quiet sensation you have now that every broken edge is also a horizon, and beyond it lies not necessarily a hidden revelation, but a world whose people understood uncertainty so well that even their memory of it reaches you in pieces. And perhaps that is fitting, because if this civilization feared instability, then its surviving voice was always likely to sound a little unstable too. Not false, not empty, just incomplete in the same patient, haunting way the ancient world itself must often have felt. Just incomplete in the same patient, haunting way the ancient world itself must often have felt, which is why ritual begins to matter more the longer you stay here. When certainty is broken, repetition becomes a kind of shelter. Most historians agree that ritual in Mesopotamia was meant to maintain right relationship between human communities, divine powers, kingship, and the larger order of the world. What's broadly accepted is that rites offerings, hymns, purification acts, and calendrical observances were not optional, decorative extras. They were woven into how people understood stability itself. Archaeology suggests that ritual practice was tied to temples, households, seasonal cycles, and political authority, creating a framework through which disorder could be answered with form, sequence, and sound. And form matters when life is fragile. You can feel it now as you step in imagination into a temple chamber before dawn. The air is cool, dim, and touched by the smell of oil, clay, and a faint trace of incense. Someone moves softly in the half-light, arranging vessels, cloth, grain, perhaps a small offering of food or drink. A voice begins low, measured, and practiced. Nothing dramatic happens. No walls tremble, no sky splits open. The power of the moment lies precisely in its refusal to be chaotic. Everything is placed, timed, washed, spoken, and repeated. One interpretation is that ritual in Sumer and later Mesopotamia functioned not only as devotion, but as an answer to instability. A careful reading might suggest that repeated sacred actions helped people feel that disorder could be met, if not eliminated, through discipline and continuity. If the canal fails, repair it. If the omens darken, perform the rite. If the season turns uncertain, observe the calendar more carefully. If anxiety rises, tighten the pattern. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that repeatedly meets danger by doubling down on form. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian ritual should be understood mainly as piety, social control, psychological reassurance, cosmic maintenance, or some deeply entangled combination of all four. That answer again is probably mixed. Human beings are annoyingly layered creatures. A king may sponsor a ritual because he believes in divine order, because it strengthens legitimacy, because the people expect it, and because, frankly, this is not the month to gamble on angering heaven. A priest may recite a hymn with sincere reverence, while also knowing that the sequence itself calms a room. Ritual can be many things at once, especially in a world where ecology, politics, and theology all keep stepping on each other's toes. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious practice often aimed at preserving balance between ordered life and threatening chaos. That balance matters because the world of southern Mesopotamia is never fully secure. Water can rise, water can fail, crops can suffer, kings can overreach, enemies can appear, disease can spread, labour can run short. The practical world offers no permanent guarantee, so ritual becomes one more layer of preparedness, not against one specific event, but against the constant possibility that the order holding life together may loosen. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated rites that later gather around myths of divine warning and judgment are not merely about honouring the gods, but about rehearsing survival in symbolic form? Not survival in the crude modern sense of bunker doors and emergency kits stacked with suspicious beans, but survival as continuity. Keep the name, keep the sequence, keep the offering, keep the memory, keep the city legible to itself. A fringe idea proposes that some Mesopotamian rituals preserve distorted memory of preparations for extraordinary catastrophe beyond the famous flood stories. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. There is no mainstream basis for claiming that a standard temple rite was secretly encoding instructions for an unnamed super disaster. A more cautious explanation could be that recurring crises made ritual feel essential because ritual offered the one thing disaster threatens first order. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the connection becomes emotionally persuasive. A city that stores grain against hunger, reads the sky against danger, and builds temples against disorder may also perform rituals as a way of keeping panic from becoming the default language of life. In that sense, ritual is not denial, it is disciplined memory. It says the world may wobble, but there is still a way to stand inside it. You hear that standing in the sound itself. The hymn unfolds slowly, each phrase deliberate, each pause measured. A lamp flame shifts, a bronze vessel rings softly when touched. Somewhere beyond the chamber, a courtyard bird makes one sleepy complaint and then thinks better of it. The silence around the rite is not empty, it is full of held breath, full of all the things not said directly: flood, failure, omen, loss, hope, routine, fear trimmed into ceremony so that people can bear it. One interpretation is that divine order in Mesopotamian thought may have been less about perfection than about constant maintenance. That matters for the Anunnaki question, because powerful divine beings in such a world need not represent mystery in the flashy sense. They may represent the upper tier of a cosmic system, always involved in sorting, assigning, correcting, preserving. If later myths place them near decisions of destruction or survival that may reflect a civilization already used to imagining order as something administered under stress. That is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying the Anunnaki were literally conducting ritualized disaster planning sessions above the clouds. That is a possibility some would enjoy very much, but it is not supported by strong evidence. What may be closer to the mark is that stories about divine powers preserve the mood of a society where danger required response, response required order, and order required repetition. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know rituals mattered. We know they structured time hierarchy and sacred expectation. What we cannot fully confirm is how deeply those rites were shaped by recurring collective fear, or how much later literary memory enlarged that fear into grand divine drama. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the centrality of ritual to Mesopotamian public and sacred life. The interpretation is that ritual may also have functioned as a cultural strategy for holding instability at bay. The imagined part is the soft scene before you now, where the final words of a hymn disappear into cool brick air, and for a moment the whole chamber seems steadier, as though repetition itself has pushed back the dark by an inch. And perhaps that is all people have ever wanted from ritual. Not total safety, not final certainty, just one more inch of steadiness. One more day in which the lamps are lit, the grain is counted, the names are spoken correctly, and the city continues to believe that chaos, however patient, can still be delayed by a well-kept pattern. One more inch of steadiness, one more day of lit lamps and measured grain, and eventually even the strangest theory begins to look less like a random fantasy and more like a distorted reflection of a real emotional landscape. That is where you arrive now at the edge of the fringe idea itself. A fringe idea proposes that certain Mesopotamian traditions hint the Anunnaki were preparing for something worse than the flood. There it is, stated carefully, without drum rolls and without pretending the clay has signed off on the claim. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are religious and literary works shaped by symbolic language, political context, inherited motifs, and lived environmental stress. What's broadly accepted is that flood stories, divine counsels, ritual order, and warnings from above belong first within that world. Still, fringe theories do not appear from nowhere. They usually grow where the historical ground is real but emotionally charged. They take a true atmosphere and stretch it too far. They notice repeated motifs of warning, selection, preservation, and divine distance, then try to force them into one gigantic conclusion. The conclusion is usually the weakest part. The atmosphere is often the part worth keeping. You can almost feel that atmosphere now in the accumulated pattern of everything you have walked through tonight. The unstable rivers, the sky watchers, the granaries, the temple platforms, the broken tablets, the repeated rituals, the divine names hovering over civic life. One interpretation is that later readers sense correctly that Mesopotamian culture was saturated with preparedness, but then misread the cause by looking for one single hidden threat. A more cautious explanation could be that the people of Sumer were simply surrounded by many overlapping dangers, and their myths learned to speak in large, layered symbols because ordinary language was not roomy enough. Historians still argue whether modern fascination with Mesopotamian mystery says more about the ancient texts themselves or about our own hunger for hidden coherence. That is a deliciously annoying question because the answer may be both. Ancient texts do invite wonder. They arrive old, damaged, ceremonial, and full of beings whose motives are not always transparent. But modern readers also bring a powerful desire for the grand, reveal the master key, the secret underneath the story. We want the flood to stand for one thing. We want the Anunnaki to be one kind of being. We want the warning to point to one event. Ancient traditions unhelpfully and magnificently keep refusing that simplification. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not dismissing every mystery outright. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and sometimes mainstream caution can become a little too tidy. But if we treat the fringe idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then it may raise the possibility that what later readers are reacting to is a genuine pattern of ancient fear. Not fear of one disaster, but fear of cascading instability, so severe that flood becomes merely the most famous symbol. That makes the theory more interesting and less reckless, because then something worse than the flood does not need to mean a hidden super event with a missing dossier. It could mean the thing civilizations dread most: total systems failure, water where you do not want it, no water where you do want it, fields turning hostile with salt, labour breaking down, trade stalling, kings choosing badly, omens darkening, ritual confidence cracking, memory itself growing thin at the edges. In such a world, flood is dreadful, yes, but worse than flood might be the moment everything that normally limits disaster stops working together. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian life as a constant balancing act among many risks. Archaeology suggests that environmental stress, political competition, and institutional pressure shaped city life over long stretches of time. Most historians agree that no single apocalypse needs to be invented to explain why these cultures valued preparation so intensely. The preparation makes sense already. And yet the theory lingers. Why? Partly because stories about divine warning are compelling, partly because broken evidence invites overreach, partly because human beings are extremely susceptible to the sentence, "They knew more than they told us," which has probably been true in some boring office somewhere every day since cities were invented. But deeper than that, one interpretation is that the theory survives because it names a feeling the mainstream account already contains in quieter form. That feeling is this: the people of ancient Mesopotamia understood that visible disaster is often only the front edge of a wider unravelling. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the fringe theory is wrong in detail, but not entirely wrong in mood? What if it misidentifies the threat, but senses correctly that Mesopotamian traditions carry an unusual awareness of layered crisis? That would explain why the myths feel so charged. They are not merely about one flood or one divine mood swing. They are about living in a world where order has to be constantly defended against pressures that arrive from several directions at once. You can feel that layered pressure now in a quiet city evening. A canal runs low in one quarter and too high in another. A grain clerk reviews a list by lamp. A priest studies a sign and says little. A ruler waits for reassurance he probably does not deserve. A family stores what it can. A labourer sleeps with sore shoulders. Overhead, the stars look perfectly calm, which is rude, honestly, given the circumstances below. A popular rumour claims that ancient myths conceal a secret warning humanity has still not understood. This is a wonderfully dramatic idea, and not a strong historical conclusion. A more cautious explanation could be that myths preserve recurring patterns of human anxiety so effectively that every age thinks they are speaking directly about its own hidden crisis. That may be why these stories remain alive. They are old but not obsolete. They know what it feels like to sense pressure building before you can describe its full shape. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths emerge from a world of real environmental and social precarity. The interpretation is that later fringe readings may be exaggerating a genuine ancient sensitivity to layered danger. The imagined part is the mood surrounding the city now, where every prepared storehouse and every lifted prayer feels like a quiet acknowledgement that the worst threats are often the ones people cannot summarise in one clean sentence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm that the Anunnaki were literally preparing for some single disaster beyond the flood. We can say more carefully that Mesopotamian tradition preserves a civilization deeply attuned to warning hierarchy, fragility, and the uneasy possibility that one visible crisis may conceal a broader one behind it. And that may be enough. Not enough for a flashy certainty, but enough for a long, slow, honest shiver in the lamplight. Which is where you finally begin to see how broad the word disaster really is in a place like this. Not just flood, not just drought, not just war, but the awful possibility that several failures might start happening at once, each one making the others worse. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian societies were vulnerable to a range of overlapping pressures, including shifting river courses, destructive flooding, drought, soil, salinization, political conflict, and the strain of maintaining large irrigation systems over time. Archaeology suggests that no single crisis explains every rise or decline in the region. What's broadly accepted is that life on the southern plain required constant balancing, and when that balance tipped, the consequences could spread through food supply, labour, trade, authority, and belief all at once. That is where the phrase "something worse than the flood" starts sounding less theatrical and more like a poetic description of systemic failure. You walk now in imagination beyond the city edge into fields that should be healthy and green, but are not equally healthy everywhere. In one stretch, the irrigation channels have done their job, and the crop stands thick and promising. In another, the ground is crusted pale, where salt has crept upward through mismanaged water and hot sun, leaving the soil tired and less generous. Nearby, a canal carries too little flow for comfort. Farther off, another embankment bears the marks of recent repairs. The plain does not look apocalyptic. It looks vulnerable, which is more realistic and in its own sleepy way more unsettling. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian myths compress this kind of layered fragility into memorable narrative forms. Instead of saying our yield slowly declined, our water system became harder to maintain, our regional politics grew tense, and our confidence in stability weakened over several generations, myth says the waters came, or the gods were angered, or order was broken. A careful reading might suggest that the old stories are not simplifying reality so much as translating it into something human beings can actually carry from one generation to the next. Historians still argue whether long-term environmental pressures, especially salinity and changing water management conditions, played a decisive role in shifts within early Mesopotamian urban history, or whether political and institutional factors deserve equal or greater weight. That debate matters because it keeps you from flattening the past into one cause. Civilizations almost never collapse for one clean reason. They fray, they strain, they adapt unevenly. Some districts suffer first. Some institutions hold longer than expected. Some rulers make things worse while claiming to fix them, a habit so timeless it barely needs translation. What the evidence we do have points to is a world where multiple pressures were normal. Flood was dramatic, but slower forms of failure may have been just as frightening because they were harder to resist and easier to deny. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When we ask whether the Anunnaki were preparing for something worse than the flood, we do not need to imagine a hidden mega-disaster dropped mysteriously into the record from nowhere. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is not the strongest reading. A more cautious explanation could be that worse means broader. Not deeper water, but wider breakdown. Not one event, but the breakdown of the systems meant to absorb events. You feel that difference immediately. A flood has a shape. It rises, it strikes, it leaves. Even if the damage is terrible, it is still visible. But salinized soil creeps. Administrative strain accumulates. Canal neglect compounds. Distrust spreads. Food pressure tightens. Political rivalry drains labour and attention. Ritual confidence begins to feel more urgent because ordinary confidence has started to wobble. This is harder to narrate, which may be why flood remains the famous symbol. Water gives catastrophe a body. Systemic failure gives it a mood. And moods are harder to preserve in clay. A fringe idea proposes that some Mesopotamian traditions hint at knowledge of a coming catastrophe, so comprehensive that the flood was only the recognisable outer layer. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it may raise the possibility that old myths encode awareness of cascading risks rather than one single extraordinary threat. That version is less sensational, but it sits more comfortably on the historical ground we actually have. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian life was shaped by the interplay of environment, labour, and political authority. That interdependence matters because once one piece weakens, the others feel it. A canal needs workers. Workers need food. Food needs fields. Fields need water. Water needs management. Management needs legitimacy. Legitimacy often needs ritual confidence, successful distribution, and a ruler who is not making bafflingly poor decisions before lunch. Nothing stands alone. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the fear preserved in the myths is not of one object, one enemy, or one punishment, but of the horrifying moment when everything that normally cushions disaster begins failing together? In that light, worse than the flood becomes almost painfully human. It means the realization that no single repair will solve the problem. The granary helps, but not forever. The ritual steadies people, but not forever. The wall protects one boundary, not every boundary. The tablet remembers, but memory does not irrigate the field. Every old solution still matters, yet none is sufficient by itself. You can feel this now in a city evening touched by strain. A grain clerk counts more carefully than last year. A priest performs the rite with a little extra precision. A labour crew is redirected from one canal to another. Rumours move quietly through courtyards. Nothing has fully broken. That is what makes it worse. The world is still functioning, but with a tone of tightening around the edges. The donkey is still complaining, because of course it is, but now even the donkey sounds like part of a larger omen. Archaeology suggests that regional patterns in Mesopotamian history often involved adaptation rather than immediate collapse. That detail is important. Ancient people were not passive victims waiting dramatically for fate. They adjusted, shifted, rebuilt, reallocated, and endured. One interpretation is that this long familiarity with adaptation may itself have shaped the myths. Stories of warning and preservation do not only reflect fear, they reflect resilience under pressure. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the layered vulnerability of Mesopotamian life, from water management to salinity to political strain. The interpretation is that myths may compress many interacting threats into one memorable catastrophe. The imagined part is the atmosphere hanging over the plain now where dust settles over fields that are fertile in one direction and tired in another, and where the city beyond the canal lights its lamps as if routine itself might keep the larger unravelling just outside the gate for one more night. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm a single hidden super threat waiting behind the flood story. What we can say is that the civilization which produced these myths knew perhaps better than most that danger rarely travels by itself. It arrives in clusters, in sequences, in chains of cause and strain. And once you understand that the old title changes its meaning, maybe the Anunnaki as figures in story do not prepare for a bigger wave. Maybe they stand at the edge of a bigger pattern, one in which flood is only the most visible part of a world, learning how easily order can fail from several directions at once. Maybe they stand at the edge of a bigger pattern, one in which the flood is only the most visible part of a world where warning, fear and fragile order keep circling one another without ever fully settling into a single explanation. That is where you are now, in the hardest and most honest place in the whole journey. Not at the point of revelation, at the point of limits. Most historians agree that myths preserve memory in symbolic form rather than in the style of modern reporting. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian stories about gods, judgment, warning and destruction are not transcripts of events, but cultural works shaped by religion, poetry, ritual, politics, and the pressures of lived experience. Archaeology suggests that these traditions emerged from real environments of risk and instability, yet the evidence we do have points to stories that transform those realities into something more layered than simple description. That is why they endure. They are not maps, they are weather. And weather is exactly the right word here, because these stories do not tell you one clean thing. They surround you. You can feel that now as you sit in imagination at the edge of a temple roof in the late evening, looking out over low mud brick houses, dark canal lines, and the faintest glimmer of lamps from inner courtyards. The city below is quieter than before. Somewhere a jar is being moved. Somewhere a child is finally asleep after an energetic campaign against bedtime. Somewhere a priest or scribe is still awake, still working, still pressing order into clay, while the rest of the city drifts into shadow. Above it all, the sky is clear enough to feel almost rude about it. One interpretation is that the recurring warnings in Mesopotamian literature reflect not one remembered event, but a culture trained to live with unresolved pressure. A careful reading might suggest that divine anger, flood, omen, lament, and survival all function as ways of naming stresses that no single narrative could fully contain. That possibility matters because it changes the question. Instead of asking, what exactly were they warning about you, begin asking, why did warning itself become such a central emotional pattern? Historians still argue whether the repeated warning motifs in Mesopotamian tradition reflect chiefly environmental fear, political instability, theological drama, literary inheritance, or some shifting mixture that changed from text to text. That debate is not a failure. It is the correct result of dealing with ancient material honestly. If anything, the debate protects you from the false comfort of overconfidence, Because old stories often survive precisely by refusing to collapse into one meaning, they preserve room for ritual, room for politics, room for memory, room for grief, room for explanation, room for mystery. Modern people sometimes find this infuriating because we have become very attached to the fantasy that every meaningful thing ought to come with a bullet point summary and a friendly conclusion. Ancient Mesopotamia, with its cracked tablets and slow symbols, would like a word. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying there was no historical content beneath these myths. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it would be far too dismissive. Clearly there was historical content. Real rivers, real crops, real temples, real kings, real shortages, real fears. But neither are we entitled to force all of that into a single hidden answer. A more cautious explanation could be that the power of the myths comes from their ability to gather many kinds of uncertainty under one symbolic roof. That roof in this case is warning. Warning before the flood. Warning before judgment. Warning before loss. Warning before a system gives way. Warning even when the thing being warned about remains partly undefined. That final feature is the one that matters most tonight. Because the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm that the Anunnaki, as divine figures in tradition, were literally preparing for one secret catastrophe worse than the flood. We can say that Mesopotamian culture repeatedly imagined powerful beings, institutions and rituals in relation to unstable conditions, fragile order, and the need to act before disaster became irreversible. That may sound less flashy than a hidden apocalypse, but in human terms it is far more profound. A fringe idea proposes that myths of divine warning preserve knowledge of a coming danger humanity never fully understood. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it may raise the possibility that what survives in the literature is not a lost prediction so much as a lost emotional horizon. In other words, perhaps the ancients were not naming one object or event at all. Perhaps they were preserving the feeling of living near a threshold. That helps explain why the stories still feel strangely modern. You know what a threshold feels like. Not necessarily because you are guarding a granary beside a Sumerian canal, though that would certainly add character to your evening, but because human beings still recognise the tension of partial warning. The sense that familiar systems are under strain. The sense that small disruptions may belong to a larger pattern. The sense that people in authority may know something or think they do or are desperately pretending to. Ancient Mesopotamian myths remain alive because they are very good at capturing that atmosphere without resolving it cheaply. Most historians agree that symbolic literature often preserves emotional truth, even when precise historical reconstruction remains impossible. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki stories endure partly because they stand at the meeting point of authority and uncertainty, powers above, people below, decision from beyond sight, consequence on the ground. That structure fits a civilization built on dependence, hierarchy, and environmental risk. It also fits the deeper human experience of living inside systems whose full vulnerabilities are never entirely visible. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if its true subject is not the flood, not even the gods, but the unbearable fact that human beings often sense danger before they can describe it? A city stores grain before famine arrives. A priest reads omens before catastrophe is visible. A ruler reinforces walls before attack. A family saves what it can before the season turns. In that sense, preparation always begins in ambiguity. You act first and only later discover whether your fear had the right shape. That may be why the old myths never quite finish explaining themselves. To finish explaining would be to betray the feeling they are built from. You stand now in imagination as the night deepens over the plain. The temple wall beside you still holds the day's last warmth. Far below the city is reduced to dark geometry and a handful of lamps. The canal is a black ribbon. The sky is sharp with stars. Somewhere in the silence, a scribe sets down a stylus. Somewhere else, a ritual ends. Somewhere behind a door of reed and mud grain waits in jars against tomorrow. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the symbolic, layered nature of Mesopotamian myth, and the real instability of the world that produced it. The interpretation is that warning motifs may reflect a culture attuned to thresholds it could feel more clearly than define. The imagined part is this quiet scene now where the whole city seems suspended between preparedness and uncertainty, as if the oldest lesson of all is that survival sometimes depends on respecting a danger whose final shape you may never know. And perhaps that is the most ancient wisdom hidden in plain sight. Not that someone knew everything, but that wise people learned to act even when they did not. But that wise people learned to act even when they did not know everything. And that may be the quietest truth waiting beneath all this clay, all this water, all this sky. You arrive here at last, where the rivers meet memory, where the lamps are low, the temple walls are cooling, and the city that has carried you through the night seems less like a vanished place than a habit of mind. Most historians agree that the Sumerians survived through planning, adaptation, record-keeping, labour coordination, and the stubborn maintenance of systems that could never be trusted to run themselves for long. Archaeology suggests that their world was fragile, but not helpless, unstable, but not passive. What's broadly accepted is that they endured by watching closely, storing carefully, rebuilding repeatedly, and giving both practical and sacred shape to uncertainty. That is the firm ground you can stand on as the journey closes. The flood mattered. The rivers mattered. The granaries, temples, rituals, walls and omens all mattered. And the Anunnaki within the literary and religious imagination of Mesopotamia mattered too. What we cannot fully confirm is the larger claim that they were literally preparing for one secret catastrophe worse than the flood. The evidence is too thin for that. The texts are too layered. The broken edges are too many. Historians still argue whether the warning patterns in these traditions are best understood through ecology, theology, politics, literature, or some combination that refuses to stay neatly in one box. That uncertainty should not frustrate you too much. It is part of the honesty of the subject. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not leaving with a grand, hidden truth clutched dramatically to our chest, like a prize rescued from ancient dust. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And tonight was never about pretending otherwise. We are leaving with something softer and in many ways more human. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian stories preserve a civilization trained to expect layered danger, not one threat, many, not one warning, repeated warning, not one collapse. The possibility of cascading failures, any one of which could widen into something larger. In that light, something worse than the flood may not point to a hidden super disaster at all. A more cautious explanation could be that it points to the fear of systems failing together, the fear that visible catastrophe is only the first face of a larger unravelling. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest lesson in these old traditions is simply that human beings have always sensed instability before they could fully describe it? They store grain before famine. They strengthen walls before attack. They read the sky before they understand the pattern. They perform the rite before they know whether it will help. They write the list because memory itself is a form of preparation. If later myths cast divine figures over that atmosphere, perhaps it is because ordinary human caution can feel almost holy when the world is fragile enough. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the Sumerians lived in a demanding landscape. We know they built institutions to manage risk. We know their myths preserved warning, judgment, survival, and the uneasy relationship between power and vulnerability. What we cannot confirm is a single hidden answer tying every thread together. And maybe after all this, that is exactly right. Because ancient wisdom rarely arrives as a final conclusion. It arrives as posture, as discipline, as the habit of keeping the grain dry, the canal clear, the records orderly, the ritual remembered, the eyes lifted to the horizon. The Anunnaki may remain in the mist as divine presences, symbolic authorities, or debated figures enlarged by later imagination. But the people beneath them in the stories are easier to understand. They are trying to live in a world that can turn suddenly strange, so they prepare. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the practical brilliance and vulnerability of Mesopotamian civilization. The interpretation is that its myths may preserve a broad awareness of layered danger rather than one fixed secret. The imagined part is the final scene, now opening softly around you where the city lies under stars and the last little sounds of labour and prayer have given way to stillness. The river moves in darkness beyond the reeds. The temple keeps its shape against the sky. Somewhere in a cool room, clay tablets rest with their wedge marks catching the faintest line of lamplight. Somewhere else, grain waits in jars, counted and sealed. And above all of it hangs the oldest human instinct of all, quiet now, almost tender. Be ready, not because you know exactly what is coming, but because the world has always belonged at least partly to those who respect uncertainty without surrendering to it. And now the night can soften. The city grows gentler as you watch it from this high, still place. The hard edges blur first. The walls become low shadows. The canals turn to dark silk. The fields beyond fade into one calm plain, no longer anxious with salinity labour and shifting water, but simply resting under the stars. The temple steps that carried so many feet through so many mornings now hold only cool air. The granaries do not feel heavy anymore. They feel settled. Even the broken tablets, with all their missing pieces and unanswered questions, seem less like puzzles and more like small acts of endurance, patient bits of earth that remembered enough. So you let the larger questions loosen. You do not have to solve the Anunnaki tonight. You do not have to name every warning correctly. You do not have to rebuild every broken edge of clay in your mind. You can let the old city keep some of its mystery. You can let the river flow without asking it for one final explanation. You can let the stars remain bright and distant and silent. And as the fan hums softly in your room far from the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, you can carry only the calmest part with you. That long ago, under another sky, people faced uncertainty with lists, with rituals, with walls, with grain, with stories, and with the very human decision to prepare gently for what they could not fully know. Let the lamps go dim now. Let the clay cool. Let the water pass quietly in the dark. And let the ancient city drift farther and farther away until all that remains is the feeling of stillness after watching the peace that comes after counting, and the soft comfort of knowing that even the oldest mysteries do not need to be solved to be heard.